I've earned 30 plus certifications, and I'm here to guide you to success on your exam. Welcome to the Ultimate AZ-305 Exam Masterclass. Are you ready to crack the AZ-305 exam in one go? You're in the right place. In this session, we'll arm you with powerful insights and hand-picked questions that can make all the difference in your exam performance. We've scanned the web using intelligent crawlers to gather the most critical and high-impact questions, all compiled into one powerful PDF resource. You can download it from the link in the description. Not only will we explore these must-practice questions, but we'll also share real exam experiences and pro tips to give you that competitive edge. Let's dive into the key questions that could shape your success. Question 1. You have an Azure App Service web app that writes data to an Azure SQL database. You plan to configure the database to use the Always Encrypted feature. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that the web app can write encrypted data. Which two actions should you include in the recommendations? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. A. Change the connection string used by the application. B. Change the SSL settings for the web app. C. Enable transparent data encryption (TD). D. Store keys in Azure Key Vault. E. Store keys in the certificate store. Correct answers A and D. Change the connection string used by the application. Store keys in Azure Key Vault. Explanation. The app must change its connection string to support Always Encrypted. Keys should be securely stored in Azure Key Vault. Question 2. You have an on-premises MongoDB application. You want to migrate the application to Azure. The application contains a large amount of code and significant redevelopment of the code is not being considered. You need to take advantage of global distribution and automated failover. To which type of database should you migrate the application? A. Azure Cosmos DB. B. Azure SQL Database. C. Azure SQL Managed Instance. D. MongoDB on an Azure Virtual Machine. Correct answer A. Azure Cosmos DB. Explanation. Cosmos DB supports MongoDB API with no code changes. It offers global distribution and auto failover. Question 3. You are designing a data storage solution in Azure. The solution must meet the following requirements. Be optimized for unstructured data and support geo-redundant storage (GRS). What should you include in the design? A. Azure Data Lake Storage. B. Azure SQL Database. C. Azure SQL Managed Instance. D. Azure Synapse Analytics. Correct answer A. Azure Data Lake Storage. Explanation. Azure Data Lake supports unstructured data and GRS. SQL options are for structured data only. Question 4. Which Azure storage option is best for semi-structured data and big data analytics? A. Azure Blob Storage. B. Azure Table Storage. C. Azure SQL Database. D. Azure Data Lake Storage. Correct answer D. Azure Data Lake Storage. Explanation. Azure Data Lake is optimized for analytics and semi-structured data. It works well with big data tools like Azure Synapse. Question 5. Which service allows you to manage policies across multiple Azure subscriptions? A. Azure Management Groups. B. Azure Resource Groups. C. Azure Blueprints. D. Azure Policy. Correct answer A. Azure Management Groups. Explanation. Management groups apply policies across subscriptions. They help with centralized governance. Question 6. Which tool helps analyze resource usage and estimate future costs? A. Azure Pricing Calculator. B. Azure Cost Management. C. Azure Monitor. D. Azure Advisor. Correct answer B. Azure Cost Management. Explanation. Azure Cost Management shows usage trends and forecasted costs. It helps track and manage your spending. Question 7. Which Azure service provides a managed Kubernetes container orchestration? A. Azure Functions. B. Azure Container Instances. C. Azure Kubernetes Service. D. Azure App Service. Correct answer C. Azure Kubernetes Service. Explanation. Azure Kubernetes Service offers full container orchestration. It automates scaling, updates, and cluster management. Question 8. Which Azure service is best suited for hosting a website with minimal server management? A. Azure Functions. B. Azure Virtual Machines. C. Azure App Service. D. Azure Container Instances. Correct answer C. Azure App Service. Explanation. Azure App Service is ideal for websites with managed hosting. It handles scaling, patching, and maintenance for you. Question 9. Which Azure service would you use to protect against DDoS attacks? A. Azure Firewall. B. Azure DDoS Protection. C. Azure Application Gateway. D. Azure Front Door. Correct answer B. Azure DDoS Protection. Explanation. Azure DDoS Protection safeguards against distributed denial-of-service attacks. It automatically detects and mitigates large-scale threats. Question 10. Which Azure service allows you to securely store API keys, passwords, and certificates? A. Azure Active Directory. B. Azure Security Center. C. Azure Key Vault. D. Azure App Configuration. Correct answer C. Azure Key Vault. Explanation. Azure Key Vault stores secrets like keys and passwords securely. It supports auditing and role-based access control. Question 11. You want to automate the deployment of multiple Azure resources in a consistent manner. Which service should you use? A. Azure DevOps. B. Azure Automation. C. Azure Blueprints. D. Azure Advisor. Correct answer C. Azure Blueprints. Explanation. Azure Blueprints let you package ARM templates, policies, and RBC. They ensure consistent deployment across environments. Question 12. You want to assign a user access to manage resources in a specific Azure subscription. What should you use? A. Azure Active Directory roles. B. Azure Management Groups. C. Role-Based Access Control RBC. D. Azure Policy. Correct answer C. Role-Based Access Control RBC. Explanation. RBC allows fine-grained access to Azure resources. You can assign roles at subscription or resource level. Question 13. Which Azure service allows hosting of event-driven serverless code? A. Azure Logic Apps. B. Azure App Service. C. Azure Functions. D. Azure Automation. Correct answer C. Azure Functions. Explanation. Azure Functions runs serverless code triggered by events. You only pay for execution time, not servers. Question 14. You need to store frequently accessed, unstructured data for a web application. Which Azure storage tier is most appropriate? A. Hot tier. B. Cool tier. C. Archive tier. D. Premium file storage. Correct answer A. Hot tier. Explanation. The hot tier is designed for frequent data access. It provides the fastest access with higher cost. Question 15. You want to secure Azure resources using a firewall that filters outbound traffic. Which service should you use? A. Azure Application Gateway. B. Azure Front Door. C. Azure Firewall. D. Azure DDoS Protection. Correct answer, C. Azure Firewall. Explanation. Azure Firewall inspects and controls both inbound and outbound traffic. It is a managed, scalable, stateful firewall service. Question 16. Which Azure storage option supports NFS and SMB protocols? A. Azure Table Storage. B. Azure Blob Storage. C. Azure Files. D. Azure Queue Storage. Correct answer, C. Explanation. Azure Files supports NFS and SMB for file sharing. It enables lift and shift of on-premises file shares to cloud. Question 17. Which Azure tool provides performance recommendations for your resources? A. Azure Cost Management. B. Azure Monitor. C. Azure Advisor. D. Azure Resource Graph. Correct answer, C. Azure Advisor. Explanation. Azure Advisor gives best practice recommendations. It improves performance, security, and cost efficiency. Question 18. You need to track the health and usage of Azure services in your subscription. Which service should you use? A. Azure Monitor. B. Azure Policy. C. Azure Activity Log. D. Azure Blueprints. Correct answer A. Azure Monitor. Explanation. Azure Monitor collects metrics and logs for services. It helps monitor health, usage, and performance. Question 19. Which tool allows you to define policies that enforce organizational standards? A. Azure Resource Graph. B. Azure Blueprints. C. Azure Policy. D. Azure RBC. Correct answer, C. Azure Policy. Explanation. Azure Policy ensures resources comply with defined rules. It prevents non-compliant resource creation. Question 20. Which service provides identity and access management for Azure resources? A. Azure Active Directory. B. Azure Policy. C. Azure Key Vault. D. Azure Monitor. Correct answer A. Azure Active Directory. Explanation. Azure AD manages identities and authentication in the cloud. It supports SSO and RBC across Azure services. Question 21. You need to archive and frequently access data for long-term storage at the lowest cost. Which Azure storage tier should you choose? A. Premium tier. B. Cool tier. C. Hot tier. D. Archive tier. Correct answer D. Archive tier. Explanation. The archive tier is ideal for rarely accessed data. It offers the lowest storage cost but has higher latency. Question 22. Which Azure service provides a scalable cloud database with built-in machine learning? A. Azure SQL Database. B. Azure Database for MySQL. C. Azure Synapse Analytics. D. Azure Cosmos DB. Correct answer A. Azure SQL Database. Explanation. Azure SQL Database offers built-in machine learning and intelligence. It scales automatically and supports advanced features. Question 23. Which Azure service allows real-time ingestion and processing of streaming data? A. Azure Data Factory. B. Azure Stream Analytics. C. Azure Data Lake. D. Azure Event Grid. Correct answer B. Azure Stream Analytics. Explanation. Azure Stream Analytics processes streaming data in real time. It's great for IoT, telemetry, and real-time dashboards. Question 24. You want to set a policy that prevents deploying public IPs. Which Azure feature should you use? A. Azure RBC. B. Azure Policy. C. Azure Blueprints. D. Azure Monitor. Correct answer B. Azure Policy. Explanation. Azure Policy enforces rules like blocking public IPs. It ensures compliance before deployment happens. Question 25. Which Azure feature provides a unified view of application performance and logs? A. Azure Security Center. B. Azure Monitor. C. Azure Sentinel. D. Azure Advisor. Correct answer B. Azure Monitor. Explanation. Azure Monitor tracks performance and logs in one place. It helps detect, diagnose, and fix issues quickly. Question 26. Which service helps secure, monitor, and manage virtual networks? A. Azure Network Watcher. B. Azure Security Center. C. Azure Express Route. D. Azure Traffic Manager. Correct answer A. Azure Network Watcher. Explanation. Azure Network Watcher monitors and diagnoses network issues. It helps visualize traffic flow and troubleshoot connectivity. Question 27. Which Azure service allows building workflows with little or no code? A. Azure Functions. B. Azure Logic Apps. C. Azure Event Grid. D. Azure DevOps Pipelines. Correct answer B. Azure Logic Apps. Explanation. Azure Logic Apps automate workflows with minimal code. They connect cloud services, apps, and data easily. Question 28. You want to connect your on-premises network securely to Azure. Which option should you use? A. Azure CDN. B. Azure Express Route. C. Azure Bastion. D. Azure Load Balancer. Correct answer B. Azure Express Route. Explanation. Express Route provides a private, secure connection to Azure. It doesn't go over the public internet. Question 29. Which Azure service helps you detect and respond to security threats? A. Azure Sentinel. B. Azure Key Vault. C. Azure Monitor. D. Azure DevTest Labs. Correct answer A. Azure Sentinel. Explanation. Azure Sentinel is a cloud-native CM and SOAR tool. It detects threats and automates response actions. Question 30. You need a globally distributed, multi-model NoSQL database. Which Azure service fits this requirement? A. Azure SQL Database. B. Azure Blob Storage. C. Azure Cosmos DB. D. Azure Data Lake. Correct answer C. Azure Cosmos DB. Explanation. Azure Cosmos DB supports global distribution and NoSQL APIs. It offers low-latency access across regions. Please revise full PDF 2 to 3 times for 100% success. Check the description for the PDF download link and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for upcoming episodes. Thank you.